There comes a moment in life when you realize you're running out of chances to start over. For 70-year-old Vernon Ashby, that moment came the day he lost his pension to a bad investment and had nothing left but his pride and his grown son's worried phone calls. When he saw a farm listed for $50, most folks would have laughed. Vernon saw hope. His son Curtis drove out to help, mostly to make sure his father wasn't losing his mind. The farm was rough, windswept, and forgotten. Then Curtis opened the barn. Inside was a steel vault built into the foundation, sealed tight for decades. What they found would tie them to a Cold War secret that changed everything. What was hidden in that vault? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Vernon Ashby had worn the same gold wedding band for 47 years. 3 years after Charlotte's death, it still circled his finger, a little looser now, catching the light as he gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup. The metal had thinned over the decades, worn down by a lifetime of work, sorting mail at the post office, fixing things around the house, holding his wife's hand through her final days. He twisted it absently as he drove, a habit that had become almost unconscious. The investment had seemed safe. That's what Douglas Kepner had told him anyway. They'd worked together for 30 years at the Postal Distribution Center in Cheyenne. When Douglas retired 2 years before Vernon, he'd started a consulting business helping small towns modernize their mail systems. It made sense. Douglas knew the work inside and out. When he'd asked Vernon to invest his savings, $43,000 accumulated over 4 decades, it had felt like helping an old friend more than taking a risk. The business collapsed in 18 months. Douglas had overextended, taken on debt, made promises he couldn't keep. By the time the bankruptcy papers were filed, there was nothing left to recover. Douglas apologized, genuinely devastated, but apologies didn't pay the bills. Vernon's pension covered rent and groceries, but the savings were supposed to be his cushion, his security, his way of leaving something behind for Curtis. Vernon glanced at his son in the passenger seat, pretending to sleep but clearly just avoiding conversation. 28 years old, working some kind of computer job in Denver that Vernon didn't fully understand. Something about networks and security systems. Curtis had tried to explain it once, but the technical language had washed over Vernon like rain on stone. What Vernon did understand was that his son made good money, lived alone in a small apartment, and called his father every Sunday out of duty more than desire. The divorce had been final for 6 months. Curtis hadn't offered many details, just that he and Stephanie had grown apart. Vernon suspected there was more to it. There always was. But Curtis had inherited his father's tendency toward silence. Charlotte had been the one who drew them both out, who insisted on family dinners and long conversations. Without her, Vernon and Curtis had drifted into a pattern of surface-level check-ins and uncomfortable pauses. When Vernon had called to tell Curtis about the farm, his son's first response had been a long silence. "Then, Dad, are you sure about this?" The concern in his voice had been unmistakable. Curtis thought his father was losing his grip, making desperate decisions, spiraling into the kind of isolation that worried adult children recognized in their aging parents. Maybe he was right. Vernon had found the listing on a Friday afternoon, scrolling through estate sales on a website Curtis had shown him. Most of the properties were selling furniture or antiques, but this one caught his eye. 80-acre farm, High Plains region, as his condition, 50 reserve. The photographs showed a weathered farmhouse, an enormous red barn, and endless stretches of brown grassland under an empty sky. $50. Less than a tank of gas. Less than a week's groceries. The listing explained it was the final property from an estate that had been in legal limbo for decades, and the heirs just wanted it gone. No utilities currently connected. No guarantees about the condition of the structures. Buyer responsible for all inspections and repairs. Most people would see a money pit. Vernon saw possibility. He'd placed the bid on impulse, not expecting to win. When the confirmation email arrived 3 days later, he'd stared at his computer screen for 20 minutes, trying to decide if he'd made a terrible mistake. Then he'd called Curtis. His son had driven up from Denver the next weekend, ostensibly to help him think it through, but really to talk him out of it. They'd sat at Vernon's small kitchen table, the same table where Charlotte used to serve Sunday dinners, and Curtis had pulled up satellite images of the property on his laptop. "Dad, look at this. There's nothing out there. The nearest town is 40 minutes away. No neighbors for miles. The house looks like it's falling apart." Curtis had zoomed in on the farmhouse, highlighting the sagging porch and missing shingles. "What are you going to do out there?" Vernon had looked at the screen, at the isolation his son saw as a problem. "Start over," he'd said simply. "I can't stay in that apartment anymore, Curtis. Every wall reminds me of your mother. Every street corner has a memory. I need something different." Curtis had closed his laptop slowly. "This isn't different, Dad. This is running away." "Maybe," Vernon had admitted. "But maybe that's what I need right now." They'd argued, carefully and quietly, the way they always did. Curtis had brought up practical concerns: Vernon's age, the physical demands of maintaining property, the isolation, the cost of making the place livable. Vernon had countered each point with stubborn optimism that even he didn't quite believe. Finally, Curtis had sighed and said the thing Vernon had been waiting for. "I'm not letting you do this alone. I'll take time off work and come with you, at least for the first month." That had been 2 weeks ago. Now they were 3 hours into the drive, the landscape growing emptier with each passing mile. The interstate had given way to state highways, which had narrowed to county roads. Fences lined both sides of the road, marking off ranches and farmland, but they'd seen fewer than a dozen houses in the past hour. Vernon turned off the county road onto what the GPS identified as their destination. It wasn't paved, just 2 ruts of hard-packed dirt cutting through the grassland. The truck bounced and rattled as they followed the track, dust rising behind them in a long plume. "How much farther?" Curtis asked, giving up the pretense of sleep. "Should be just ahead," Vernon said, squinting at the horizon. The farmhouse appeared first, a 2-story structure that had once been white but had faded to the color of old bone. The porch sagged on one side, and several windows were boarded over. Behind it, dominating the landscape, stood the barn. It was massive, easily twice the size of the house, painted a deep red that had held its color better than anything else on the property. The barn doors were closed, and even from a distance Vernon could see they were built from thick timber, reinforced with iron bands. Curtis let out a low whistle. "That barn is huge. What do you think they kept in there?" "Guess we'll find out," Vernon said, pulling the truck to a stop in front of the house. They sat for a moment, taking it in. The wind was constant, bending the grass in waves, whistling around the truck's windows. The sky stretched overhead, pale blue and endless, without a single cloud to break the monotony. It was beautiful in its own stark way, but Vernon understood why Curtis looked apprehensive. "Well," Vernon said, opening his door, "let's see what $50 bought us." The house was worse inside than it had appeared from the road. Water damage stained the ceilings, the floorboards creaked ominously, and a family of mice had made a nest in the kitchen cabinets. But the structure seemed sound. No major cracks in the foundation, no obvious signs of rot in the load-bearing walls. With work, it could be livable. Curtis was less optimistic. "Dad, this is going to cost thousands to fix up." "Tens of thousands, probably. You don't have that kind of money." "I've got time," Vernon said, "and I've got 2 hands. I can do a lot of the work myself." "You're 70 years old. I'm aware of my age, Curtis." Vernon kept his voice level, but there was an edge to it. "I'm not helpless." Curtis held up his hands in surrender. "I know, I'm sorry. I just worry." Vernon's expression softened. "I know you do, but worrying won't make this place any better. Work will." They spent the next hour unloading the truck. Vernon's clothes and personal belongings, boxes of tools, camping equipment they'd brought since the utilities weren't connected yet. Curtis set up a portable generator they'd purchased at a hardware store in Cheyenne, and they tested it successfully. "I'm going to check out the barn," Curtis announced after they'd finished. "See what's in there." "I'll get the water pump going," Vernon said. "The well should still be functional, according to the inspection report." Curtis grabbed a flashlight from the truck and headed toward the barn. Vernon watched him go, then turned his attention to the wellhead near the house. He was kneeling beside it, examining the pump mechanism, when he heard Curtis shout, Dad, you need to see this." The urgency in his son's voice brought Vernon to his feet faster than he'd moved in months. He jogged toward the barn, his knees protesting, and found Curtis standing just inside the open barn doors, flashlight aimed at the floor. The barn's interior was mostly empty. Some rotted hay bales, old farming equipment reduced to rust, a few empty stalls along one wall. But Curtis wasn't looking at any of that. He was pointing at the far corner, where the wooden floor ended and concrete began. Vernon moved closer, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. What he saw made his breath catch. Set into the concrete floor was a steel door, not a cellar door or a root cellar entrance, but something else entirely. It was massive, at least 4 feet across, made of reinforced steel that had resisted the decades better than anything else on the property. The metal was dull gray, marked with rivets around the edges. In the center, stenciled in faded yellow paint, were words that made Vernon's stomach tighten. Property of U.S. government. Below that, a date, 1962. And below that, a combination lock with 8 digits, its brass dial still gleaming despite the years. Curtis knelt beside it, running his hand over the steel. "What the hell is this doing here?" Vernon couldn't answer. He stared at the vault door, at the government markings, at the date that placed it squarely in the middle of the Cold War. He thought about the listing's vague history, the legal limbo, the fact that no one had wanted this property for decades.
"I don't know," Vernon finally said.
"But I think we just found out why this place sold for $50. Curtis circled the vault door slowly, his flashlight beam tracing its edges. Vernon stood back, still processing what they'd found. The barn suddenly felt different, less like an abandoned farm building and more like a shell concealing something far more significant. "There's no rust on the hinges," Curtis observed, crouching to examine the mechanism. "This thing was built to last. Military grade, probably." He looked up at his father. "Did the listing mention anything about this?" Vernon shook his head. "Nothing. Just said it was an estate sale. Property in as-is condition." He moved closer, kneeling with some difficulty beside his son. Up close, he could see more details. The precision of the metalwork, the way the vault door sat perfectly flush with the surrounding concrete, the small ventilation grate built into one corner. "Ventilation," Curtis said, pointing to the same grate. "Whatever's down there, it needed air circulation." "Or whoever," Vernon said quietly. They looked at each other. Curtis stood and swept his flashlight across the rest of the barn floor. "There," he pointed to a section of wall near the vault. A metal conduit ran along the baseboard, disappearing into the ground. Electrical line. This wasn't just storage, Dad. This was an active facility. Vernon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd lived through the Cold War, remembered the duck and cover drills in school, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the ever-present fear of nuclear annihilation. The government had built all kinds of things back then. Bunkers, test sites, facilities that citizens weren't supposed to know about. He'd just never imagined buying one for $50. "We should try to open it," Curtis said, already examining the combination lock. "Curtis, wait, just to see if it still works." "I'm not saying we go down there right away." Curtis spun the dial experimentally. It moved smoothly, well-maintained despite the decades. 8 digits. That's unusual. Most combination locks are 3 or 4. Vernon stood, his knees cracking. "We don't know what's down there. Could be dangerous. Could be nothing but mold and rats. Could be answers," Curtis countered. He stood as well, facing his father. "Dad, this is on your property. Whatever's down there, it's yours now. Don't you want to know?" Of course he did. Vernon had spent 3 years trying not to think about the past, trying to move forward. But here was something that demanded investigation. A mystery literally built into the foundation of his new home. But caution held him back. The caution of a man who'd learned that curiosity could have consequences. "We try to open it," Vernon said slowly. "But carefully. And if we get it open, we don't go down there without proper preparation." "Agreed," Curtis nodded. "Agreed." They spent the next 20 minutes attempting different combinations. Birthdays, historical dates, sequential numbers. Nothing worked. The dial spun freely, but the lock mechanism never engaged. "We need the actual combination," Curtis finally admitted, sitting back on his heels. "This isn't something we can just guess." Vernon looked around the barn with fresh eyes. If there was a vault, there might be other things hidden here, papers, documents, anything that might provide a clue. "Let's search the property. Maybe whoever built this left something behind." They started with the barn itself, moving systematically through the space. Most of what they found was exactly what you'd expect. Old tools, broken equipment, the detritus of decades of neglect. But in a corner behind a collapsed stall, Curtis discovered something different. A metal box, about the size of a briefcase, tucked under a rotted board. "Dad, look at this." The box was locked, but the lock was rusted through. Curtis pried it open with a screwdriver from the truck. Inside, wrapped in plastic that had yellowed with age, were papers. Vernon lifted them out carefully. The top document was a property deed, dated 1961, transferring the land to something called Federal Land Trust, Department of Defense. Below that were maintenance schedules, delivery receipts, and equipment inventories. Everything was stamped with security classifications. Confidential, restricted, for official use only. This was a government facility, Vernon said, stating the obvious, because it helped make it real, not just a bunker or storage. An active operation, Curtis was reading over his shoulder. "Look at the dates." Everything stops in 1963, just stops. Like someone flipped a switch and walked away. Vernon shuffled through more papers. Supply orders for medical equipment, food rations, cleaning supplies, personnel rosters with names he didn't recognize, and ranks that suggested military personnel. And then, near the bottom of the stack, something that made his hands shake. It was a memo dated March 1963, marked classified. The header read, "Re-facility decommissioning and permanent closure." The text was brief, bureaucratic, chilling in its casual tone. "All research materials to be secured in primary vault. Facility to be sealed per standard protocol. No further access authorized. All personnel reassigned effective immediately." "Research materials," Curtis read aloud. "What kind of research do you do on a farm in the middle of nowhere?" Vernon didn't answer. He was thinking about the Cold War, about the things governments did in the name of national security, about projects that were never meant to see daylight. He folded the papers carefully and tucked them back in the box. "We need to look in the house," he said. "If there are papers in the barn, there might be more in the house. Maybe something with the combination." They spent the rest of the afternoon searching. The house was largely empty, but the attic proved more promising. Under layers of dust and bird droppings, they found more boxes, personal effects left behind when the facility closed. Most were mundane, clothes, books, basic supplies. But Curtis discovered one box that was different. "Dad, come here." Inside the box was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded. Curtis opened it carefully. The first page bore an inscription in neat handwriting. "Property of A.M., Site Administrator, 1961. Vernon took the journal, handling it like the fragile thing it was. The entries were sporadic, more log than diary, but they painted a picture of daily life at the facility. References to the project, mentions of deliveries and inspections, notes about maintenance issues. The tone was professional, detached, until the later entries. Vernon read aloud, "January 12, 1963. Dr. Harrigan expressed concerns about the ethical implications of the latest trials. I share his concerns, but have been instructed that such matters are above our clearance level." He flipped ahead. "February 20th, 1963. 3 more subjects arrived today. They look so young. I try not to think about what happens to them in the lower levels." Curtis was reading over his father's shoulder again. Lower levels. "There's more than one floor down there." The final entry was dated March 3rd, 1963. "Orders came through this morning. We're sealing everything permanently. They're calling it a security measure, but I know what it really is. A cover-up. I've been told to forget everything I saw here." We all have. God help us for what we did in the name of protecting this country. Vernon closed the journal. The afternoon light slanting through the attic window suddenly felt too bright, too ordinary for what they'd just read. "We need to get into that vault," Curtis said, his voice tight. "We need to see what they were doing down there." Vernon wanted to disagree, wanted to suggest they call the authorities and let them handle it. But he knew his son was right. This was their property now, and whatever had happened here, whatever had been done in the name of national security, deserved to be brought to light. "Tomorrow," Vernon said. "Tonight we rest, think about this. Tomorrow we figure out how to get that vault open." They returned to the barn as the sun was setting, both drawn back to the steel door, despite their exhaustion. Vernon stood at the edge of the concrete pad, looking down at the government markings, at the date that marked the height of Cold War paranoia. Curtis knelt and ran his hand along the edge of the vault door. "Feel this," he said. Vernon bent down. There was a slight hiss of air escaping from the seal. "It's not just locked," Curtis said. "It's hermetically sealed. Whatever's down there, they wanted to preserve it." They stood in the gathering darkness, the wind whistling through the barn's gaps, and made a silent agreement. They would open the vault. They would discover what the government had hidden here, and they would decide what to do with whatever they found. Vernon twisted his wedding ring, thinking about Charlotte, about the secrets people kept, about the weight of truth. He had no way of knowing that the biggest secret buried on this property would turn out to be his own. Vernon woke before dawn, his back protesting from a night spent in a sleeping bag on the farmhouse floor. Curtis was already up, sitting by the window with his laptop, the screen's glow pale in the pre-dawn light. "Couldn't sleep either?" Vernon asked, working himself into a sitting position. Curtis looked up. "I've been researching. Cold War facilities, government projects, anything I could find about this area." He turned the laptop so Vernon could see. "There's almost nothing. A few references to military installations in the region, but no specifics. Whatever happened here, they scrubbed it pretty thoroughly." Vernon stood, joints popping, and moved to the window. The barn was a dark silhouette against the lightening sky. The journal mentioned lower levels. "We need to know more before we try opening that vault." "I ordered some equipment online," Curtis said. "Lockpicking tools, proper flashlights, respirators, in case the air down there is bad. Should arrive in 2 days." "2 days," Vernon nodded. "Gives us time to search more thoroughly." They ate a cold breakfast, granola bars and water from the truck, and then returned to the attic. In daylight, Vernon could see details he'd missed the evening before. The boxes they'd found weren't randomly stored. They were organized, labeled with dates and department codes. Curtis pulled down a box marked Admin 1962. Inside were more papers, requisition forms, budget reports, personnel evaluations. Vernon studied them while his son continued searching. One document caught his attention, a psychological evaluation form. The subject's name was redacted, just a black bar where it should have been, but the evaluation itself was detailed. Subject shows high stress resilience, but exhibits concerning emotional detachment. Recommend continued monitoring. Approved for Phase 2 trials. Curtis, look at this. His son came over, read the form, and his expression darkened. Trials. They were experimenting on people. Vernon set the form aside and reached for another. This one was a medical report, again with the name redacted. Subject experienced adverse reaction to compound XR7. Symptoms include disorientation, paranoia, elevated heart rate. Subject placed in medical observation for 72 hours. They spent the next hour going through box after box. Each one revealed more pieces of the puzzle. References to behavioral modification research, mentions of national security applications, reports on various compounds and their effects on human subjects. The clinical language couldn't disguise what was clearly a program of human experimentation. "This is like MK Ultra," Curtis said, referencing the CIA's infamous mind control experiments that had been exposed decades ago. They were doing the same thing here. Testing drugs, psychological manipulation, God knows what else. Vernon felt sick. He'd lived through that era, had believed in his government, in the rightness of the fight against communism. To learn that people, American citizens probably, had been subjected to these experiments in the name of that fight was deeply disturbing. He was about to suggest they take a break when Curtis called out from across the attic. "Dad, I found something." Curtis was holding a smaller box, wooden rather than cardboard, with a simple clasp lock. Inside were photographs, black and white, professionally taken, each one labeled with a date and location code. The first photo showed the barn exterior, circa 1961, based on the date stamp. Several men in military uniforms stood in front of it. Their faces were clear, unredacted. Vernon studied them, young men mostly, with the rigid posture of military discipline. The second photo showed the interior of what appeared to be a laboratory. Equipment lined the walls. Machines Vernon didn't recognize, glass beakers and tubes, monitoring equipment. 3 people in white coats stood in the center, one of them holding a clipboard. Curtis shuffled through more photos. Military personnel, scientists, the facility at various stages of construction and operation. Then he stopped, holding one photo closer. "Dad, look at this one." The photo showed a woman, perhaps 22 or 23 years old, standing beside a filing cabinet. She wore a nurse's uniform, her dark hair pulled back, her expression serious. She was holding a file marked classified. Vernon took the photo, his hands starting to shake. The woman's face was familiar, terribly, impossibly familiar. "That's," Curtis began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "Your mother," Vernon whispered. It was Charlotte. Younger than Vernon had ever known her, but unmistakably Charlotte. The shape of her face, the set of her jaw, the way she held herself, everything about her was exactly as he remembered from their early years together. Vernon sank down onto a crate, still gripping the photograph. He'd met Charlotte in 1964 at a church social in Cheyenne. She'd been working as a nurse at the county hospital, and he'd been starting his job at the post office. She'd never mentioned working anywhere else. She'd never mentioned anything about her past before they met. "There has to be an explanation," Curtis said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe she just looked like this woman. Maybe—" "No." Vernon turned the photo over. On the back, in faded ink, C. Brenneman, RN, medical staff, 1962. Brenneman, Charlotte's maiden name. Vernon stood abruptly, nearly dropping the photograph. He moved to the boxes they'd already searched, pulling them open again, looking for, he didn't know what, proof, context, anything that would explain why his wife of 47 years had never mentioned working at a secret government facility. Curtis helped him search, both of them moving with urgent desperation now. They found more photos of Charlotte, always in the background, always professional, never quite meeting the camera. They found her name on personnel rosters, on equipment sign-out sheets, on medical reports as the attending nurse. Then Curtis found her termination papers. "Dad, here." The document was dated April 1963. Charlotte Brenneman, registered nurse, employed November 1961 through April 1963. Termination reason, psychological distress and ethical objections to trial protocols. Security clearance revoked. Mandatory counseling required before reassignment. Vernon read it 3 times. Psychological distress, ethical objections. His Charlotte, gentle, compassionate Charlotte, had worked here, had witnessed whatever experiments they were conducting, and had objected strongly enough to be fired for it. "She tried to stop them," Curtis said quietly. "That's what this means, right?" She saw what they were doing and spoke up. Vernon thought about his wife, about the woman he'd loved for nearly half a century. He remembered her nightmares. She'd had them occasionally throughout their marriage, dreams that left her shaken and unwilling to talk about them. He'd always attributed them to her difficult childhood, which was the only past she'd ever discussed. Now he understood. The nightmares hadn't been about her childhood. They'd been about this place. He remembered how she'd react to news stories about government scandals, about classified programs being exposed. She'd watch with an intensity that seemed excessive, making comments about accountability and truth that had always struck him as unusually passionate. He'd thought she was just civic-minded. Now he realized she'd been speaking from experience. "She never told me," Vernon said, more to himself than to Curtis. 47 years together, and she never said a word. Curtis sat beside his father. Maybe she couldn't. Look at these termination papers, mandatory counseling. Its security clearance revoked. They probably made her sign an NDA, maybe threatened her if she talked. Vernon knew his son was trying to help, trying to provide a reasonable explanation for why Charlotte had kept such a massive secret. But reasonable didn't make it hurt less. He'd shared everything with Charlotte, his fears, his hopes, his past. He'd thought she'd done the same. There's more, Curtis said hesitantly. He was holding another document. Filed March 1963, 1 month before she was terminated. It's a formal complaint. Vernon took the paper. It was typed on official government letterhead, addressed to someone whose title was redacted. The complaint was brief but devastating. I am writing to formally object to the treatment of test subjects currently housed at this facility. The protocols being employed violate basic medical ethics and, in my professional opinion, constitute inhumane treatment. I request an immediate review of all ongoing trials and the implementation of proper oversight and consent procedures. It was signed Charlotte Brenneman, R.N. Vernon felt tears welling up, grief, pride, confusion, and betrayal all mixing together in a way he couldn't untangle. Charlotte had been brave. She'd seen something terrible and had spoken up, even though it cost her her job and probably traumatized her. But she'd never told him. She'd carried this burden alone for their entire marriage. She protected them, Curtis said softly, looking at his father with new understanding. The test subjects. She tried to protect them, and when that didn't work, she at least documented what happened. That's who she was, Dad. Vernon nodded, unable to speak. He looked at the photograph of young Charlotte again, at her serious expression, at the file marked classified in her hands. He thought about the woman he'd buried 3 years ago, about all the conversations they'd never had, all the pain she'd carried silently. We need to find out what happened to those people, Vernon finally said. The test subjects she tried to protect. We need to know what they did to them. Curtis squeezed his father's shoulder. Then we get that vault open. We find out the truth. Vernon carefully gathered all the documents related to Charlotte. Her photos, her personnel file, her complaint, her termination papers. He placed them in a separate box, handling each piece like the precious thing it was. These weren't just historical documents anymore. They were pieces of his wife's life, parts of her story that he'd never known existed. As the sun climbed higher, Vernon and Curtis sat together in the attic, surrounded by the evidence of government secrets and personal tragedy. The vault in the barn waited below, holding more answers. But Vernon already knew the most important thing. Charlotte had been here, had witnessed something terrible, and had tried to stop it. Whatever was in that vault, he owed it to her memory to bring it to light. The equipment Curtis had ordered arrived late the following afternoon, a brown cardboard box delivered by a confused driver who'd clearly struggled to find the property. Vernon signed for it and watched the delivery truck disappear down the dirt road, trailing dust. Inside were lock-picking tools, high-powered LED flashlights, respirator masks rated for chemical exposure, and a digital Geiger counter. Curtis had been thorough. Radiation? Vernon asked, holding up the Geiger counter. It was 1962, Curtis said. Cold War. If they were doing classified research, nuclear material isn't out of the question. He paused. Better safe than sorry. They spent the evening examining the photographs again, Vernon particularly drawn to the images of Charlotte. In one photo, she stood with a group of other medical staff. In another, she was visible through a window, apparently working in what looked like a medical bay. Each image revealed a little more about her life during those 2 years, but raised more questions than answers. Curtis had been working on his laptop, using facial recognition software to identify the other people in the photographs. Most came back with no matches. The images were too old, the resolution too poor. But he'd had success with one face, the tall, stern-looking officer who appeared in several photos. Colonel Herbert Lansing, Curtis read from a military records database. Career officer, specialized in psychological operations. Decorated service in World War II and Korea. After 1963, his record gets vague. Special assignments and classified duty stations. He retired in 1979, died in 1994. Vernon studied the photo of Lansing. The man had a hard face, the kind that suggested he'd give orders without hesitation and expect them to be followed without question. He was in charge here? Looks that way. His name appears on several of the authorization documents we found. Vernon set the photo down and picked up another one, the image of Charlotte holding the classified file. Something about it nagged at him. He looked closer at the file in her hands. The label was partially visible. Subject 23, Psych Eval. Curtis, can you enhance this image? I want to see what's written on that file. Curtis took a photo of the photograph with his phone and worked with it for several minutes, zooming and adjusting contrast. Best I can do, he said, showing Vernon the result. The file label was clearer now. Subject 23, Psychological Evaluation T. Waverley. Waverley, Vernon repeated. That name was in the journal, wasn't it? Curtis flipped through the leather journal they'd found. Here, February 1963. Corporal Waverley continues to show signs of acute distress. Dr. Harrigan recommends suspension of his treatment protocol. But Colonel Lansing insists we continue. They looked at each other. Waverley wasn't just a name in a logbook. He was a real person, a soldier, someone who'd been subjected to experiments that had caused him acute distress. We need to find out what happened to him, Vernon said. Curtis returned to his laptop, searching military databases and casualty records. It took 20 minutes, but he found something. Here, Corporal Theodore Waverley, United States Army, listed as missing in action in 1963. MIA in 1963? The Vietnam War hadn't really started yet. Official record says he disappeared during a training exercise in Nevada. Body never recovered. Curtis looked up from the screen. But we know he was here, not Nevada. Vernon felt a chill. A man goes missing, gets listed as MIA, in a state he wasn't actually in, and the military closes the case. It was the kind of cover-up that made sense for a classified facility, but it also suggested something darker, that Corporal Waverley might never have left this property. Tomorrow, Vernon said firmly. Tomorrow we open that vault. That night, Vernon couldn't sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the cracked ceiling, thinking about Charlotte. He remembered specific moments now with new understanding. Her reluctance to discuss politics. The way she'd changed the subject when government scandals came on the news. Her insistence on privacy, even within their marriage. He'd always respected her boundaries, never pushed when she said she didn't want to talk about something. Now he wondered if he should have pushed, should have asked why a woman who devoted her life to caring for others sometimes woke up screaming. Around 3 a.m, he gave up on sleep and went to sit on the porch. The stars were brilliant out here, away from any city lights. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness that somehow made the isolation feel even more profound. Curtis joined him after a few minutes. Couldn't sleep either. Too many thoughts, Vernon admitted. They sat in silence for a while. Then Curtis spoke. I've been thinking about Mom, about what it must have been like for her, carrying that secret all those years. She was protecting us, Vernon said. Protecting herself too, probably. They clearly threatened her when she left. But it cost her, Curtis said. All those nightmares, all that pain she kept inside. It must have been lonely. Vernon thought about that. Charlotte had friends, had been active in the community, had always seemed content with their life together. But there'd been a part of her that remained closed off, inaccessible even to him. He'd accepted it as just who she was. Now he understood it was a wall she'd built to contain terrible memories. I wish she'd felt safe enough to tell me, Vernon said quietly. Maybe she wanted to protect you from it, Curtis offered. Maybe she thought if you knew you'd be in danger too. It was possible. The government had clearly gone to great lengths to keep this facility secret. Charlotte might have believed that sharing what she knew would put Vernon at risk. It was the kind of selfless calculation she would make. We're going to finish what she started, Vernon said. She tried to protect those men, tried to expose what was happening. "Tomorrow we find out the rest of the story," Curtis nodded. "And then we decide what to do with it. We make it public," Vernon said firmly. "Whatever's down there, people deserve to know. Those men, Waverley and the others, they deserve to be remembered." As dawn broke, they prepared for the descent. Curtis assembled the equipment while Vernon made coffee on the portable camping stove. They ate a quick breakfast, neither speaking much, both focused on what lay ahead. At 7 o'clock they walked to the barn. The morning light slanted through the gaps in the walls, illuminating dust motes in the air. The vault door waited, unchanged, keeping its secrets. Curtis knelt beside it with the lock-picking tools. "This is going to take a while. 8-digit combination locks are complex. Take your time," Vernon said. "We've waited this long." Curtis worked methodically, listening to the lock mechanism, feeling for the subtle clicks that indicated correct numbers. Vernon watched, occasionally glancing at the photographs they'd brought with them, particularly the one of Charlotte. He felt like she should be here for this, should see that her courage hadn't been forgotten. After 2 hours, Curtis sat back, frustrated. "This isn't working. The lock mechanism is too sophisticated. I'd need specialized equipment or—" He paused. "Nor the actual combination." Vernon had been thinking about that. 4 digits you said you found already? In the journal, AM wrote them down in one of the entries, said they were part of the primary access code. But that's only half. What were the numbers? 1962, Vernon considered, the year the facility opened. What if the rest of the combination follows the same pattern? A date. What date, though? Vernon thought about the documents they'd found. When did Charlotte file her complaint? Curtis pulled out his phone, checking the photos he'd taken of the documents. March 15th, 1963. Try 315-1963, Vernon said. If her complaint was what triggered the closure, maybe they used that date in the final lock setting. Curtis looked skeptical, but positioned himself at the lock. Slowly, carefully, he entered the 8 digits, 196235153. For a moment, nothing happened. Then they heard a deep mechanical click, followed by a hiss of air. The vault door's seal broke. Curtis looked at his father, eyes wide. It worked. They grabbed the edge of the heavy door and pulled. It resisted at first, then slowly swung open, revealing a metal staircase descending into darkness. Air rushed out, stale, chemical-tinged, but not immediately dangerous smelling. Curtis aimed his flashlight down. The stairs were steep, industrial, leading to a concrete corridor below. On the wall, visible even from above, was a sign in faded yellow and black, a radiation warning symbol. Vernon felt his heart hammering. They'd opened the vault. Now they had to decide whether to descend into whatever lay beneath. Curtis pulled out the Geiger counter and turned it on. After a moment, it emitted a few scattered clicks. Background radiation, nothing dangerous. "It's safe," Curtis said. "Relatively." Vernon looked down into the darkness, thinking about Charlotte, about Corporal Waverley, about all the secrets that had been sealed away for 6 decades. He thought about the $50 farm that had seemed like such a strange bargain, and realized it had been waiting all this time for someone to open it up. "Let's go," he said. "Let's find out what they were hiding." They descended slowly, Curtis leading with the flashlight, Vernon following close behind. The stairs were solid despite the decades, each step producing a metallic ring that echoed in the confined space. Vernon counted 47 steps before they reached the bottom. The corridor stretched before them. Concrete walls painted institutional grey, overhead lighting fixtures dark and useless. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a space that seemed frozen in time. The air was thick but breathable through their respirators. 4 doors, Curtis said, playing his light along the corridor. 2 on each side. They approached the first door on the right. It stood open, revealing what appeared to be an office space. A metal desk sat against one wall, a filing cabinet beside it. Papers were scattered across the desk surface, and a coffee cup, long since dried, sat beside an old rotary telephone. Vernon entered carefully, his flashlight revealing more details. A calendar hung on the wall, still showing March 1963. Whoever had worked here had left in a hurry or had been ordered to leave everything behind. Curtis was already going through the filing cabinet. "Personnel files," he said. "Dozens of them." Vernon joined him, pulling out folders at random. Each contained a photograph, biographical information, and detailed notes about the person's psychological profile and medical history. These weren't researchers or staff. They were the test subjects. The first file Vernon opened belonged to Private Martin Greer, aged 19. The photograph showed a young man with a nervous smile, his military uniform crisp and new. The notes described him as highly suggestible and ideal for compliance testing. Later entries tracked his responses to various drugs and psychological techniques. The final note, dated February 1963, was chilling. Subject no longer responsive. Recommended for termination of study. Disposition pending. "They were kids," Curtis said, his voice tight. He was holding another file. Most of them were barely 20 years old. Vernon felt anger building in his chest, anger at the men who'd authorized this, at the system that had allowed it, at himself for having lived through this era without knowing what was being done in his country's name. They moved to the second room. This one was larger, clearly living quarters. 4 bunk beds lined the walls, each with a thin mattress and a folded blanket. Personal effects were still visible. Photographs tacked to the wall above one bunk, a pack of cigarettes on another, a letter partially written on a third. Vernon approached the letter, handling it carefully. The paper had yellowed, but the ink was still legible. "Dear Mom, I can't tell you where I am or what we're doing here. They say it's important for national security. I'm scared, though. The things they're making us do." The letter ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted or had thought better of continuing. Curtis was examining the photographs on the wall. One showed 2 young soldiers with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Another was of a young woman, probably a girlfriend or wife. A third showed a family, parents, siblings, gathered around a Christmas tree. "They had lives," Curtis said quietly. "Families waiting for them. And the families probably never knew what happened to them," Vernon added. "Just got letters saying their sons were missing or had died in training accidents." They found a footlocker under one of the bunks. Inside were more personal items, letters from home, a high school yearbook, a St. Christopher medal on a broken chain. Vernon picked up the medal, feeling its weight. Someone's mother had probably given this to her son for protection. It hadn't protected him from his own government. The third room was the laboratory. It was more extensive than the glimpses they'd seen in the photographs suggested. Long tables held equipment that Vernon couldn't identify. Machines with dials and switches, glass containers connected by rubber tubing, monitoring devices with paper readouts still rolled into their mechanisms. Curtis approached one of the machines carefully. "This looks like an EEG monitor for measuring brain activity. Why would they need that? If they were testing drugs that affected cognition or perception, they'd want to monitor brain function." Curtis moved to another section of the lab. "And these are centrifuges for separating compounds. They were synthesizing something here, not just administering existing drugs." Vernon found a notebook on one of the tables, bound in black leather. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with formulae, chemical equations that meant nothing to him, but the occasional plain English notes were clear enough. Subject 7 administered compound at 0800 hours. Initial response positive, increased suggestibility, decreased critical thinking. At 1200 hours, subject became agitated, violent, required sedation. He turned pages, finding similar entries. Different subjects, different compounds, different results, but all describing experiments that had clearly caused suffering. "Curtis, look at this." Vernon had found a logbook with dated entries. He ran his finger down the page. 23 subjects total, brought in over 2 years. Of those, 17 were transferred to other facilities. 3 were released after showing poor response to protocols, and 3 what? Vernon's voice was barely a whisper. 3 are listed as deceased during trial. They stood in silence, the weight of those words settling over them. 3 men had died here in this underground facility, in experiments that were never supposed to be revealed.
Where are they?
Curtis asked. The bodies. Where did they put them? Vernon didn't answer. He was thinking about the property above them, 80 acres of empty land, plenty of places to bury evidence. They moved to the 4th door, the one that had required Curtis's lockpicking skills to open. It had taken 15 minutes to breach, but finally the lock had given way. This room was different from the others. It was smaller, more secure, with a 2nd door inside the 1st, a safe room within the facility. And it was intact in a way the other rooms weren't. Papers were filed neatly, equipment was covered with protective tarps, and a filing cabinet in the corner had a lock that was still engaged. This is where they kept the important stuff, Curtis said. The things they really wanted to preserve. Vernon approached the filing cabinet while Curtis worked on the lock. It took only a few minutes this time. Curtis was getting better with practice. The drawer slid open, revealing neat rows of files. The first folder Vernon pulled was labeled Project Coldbrook Final Report. He opened it with shaking hands. The report was comprehensive, detailing the project's goals, methods, and results. The stated purpose was to develop reliable techniques for enhanced interrogation and behavior modification for use in intelligence operations. The methods included drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and what the report clinically described as controlled psychological trauma. The results section was damning. The report acknowledged that the techniques showed promise, but that subject, mortality and long-term psychological damage presented operational challenges. It recommended refinement of protocols and better subject selection criteria. In other words, they'd learned how to break men's minds, but too many had died or been permanently damaged in the process. Vernon felt sick. This wasn't theoretical anymore. These were documented crimes, preserved in government files, sealed away with the expectation that no one would ever see them. Dad, I found something else. Curtis was holding a different folder, this one with Charlotte's name on the tab. Inside were copies of her complaint, additional documentation of her objections, and, most significantly, a memo from Colonel Lansing. Vernon read it aloud. Nurse Brenneman's concerns are noted, but do not reflect the strategic importance of Project Coldbrook. Her lack of clearance for full operational details limits her understanding of necessity. However, her potential for disclosure represents a security risk. Recommend immediate termination of employment and implementation of standard non-disclosure protocols. Monitor for compliance. They threatened her, Curtis said. That's what standard non-disclosure protocols means. They made sure she understood what would happen if she talked. Vernon thought about Charlotte, 23 years old, faced with powerful men who'd made it clear her career, possibly her life, depended on her silence. And she'd stayed silent, carrying that burden for 47 years. He was about to close the folder when he noticed something else, a handwritten notepaper clipped to the back of the file. The handwriting was Charlotte's. He'd recognize it anywhere. The note was brief. I've documented everything I witnessed here. Someday someone will need to know the truth. I pray that day comes before more harm is done. CB. Vernon's hands trembled as he held the note. Charlotte had left a message, a breadcrumb for whoever might eventually uncover this place. She'd known the truth needed to come out, even if she couldn't be the one to reveal it. She wanted this found, Vernon said, showing Curtis the note. All these years, she hoped someone would open this vault. Curtis looked at his father, understanding dawning in his eyes. The $50 listing. Dad, what if that wasn't random? What if someone who knew about this place, made sure it got sold, made sure someone would buy it and discover what's down here? Vernon considered it. The estate sale, the unusually low price, the vague history. It could all be deliberate. Someone with knowledge of the facility might have arranged for it to finally be revealed. We need to document everything, Vernon said. Photograph every file, every piece of equipment, every bit of evidence. And then we need to decide what to do with it. They spent the next 3 hours methodically photographing the rooms, the files, the equipment. Curtis's phone memory filled up, so they used Vernon's phone as well. By the time they finished, they had thousands of images, more than enough to prove what had happened here. As they prepared to leave, Vernon paused at the threshold of the facility. He thought about the 23 men who'd been brought here, about the 3 who'd died, about Charlotte who'd tried to save them. This place was a tomb, in more ways than one. "We're coming back tomorrow," he said. "We're going to search the property. If those men are buried here, they deserve to be found." Curtis nodded grimly. They climbed the stairs, emerging into the barn as the afternoon sun slanted through the walls. The normal world seemed surreal after hours in that underground chamber. Vernon locked the vault door behind them, but he knew they were far from finished. They'd uncovered the secret. Now they had to decide what to do with it. That evening, Vernon couldn't bring himself to go back inside the farmhouse. He sat on the porch steps, watching the sun set over the grassland, thinking about the men who died on this property. Curtis sat beside him, equally quiet, both processing what they'd discovered. "We should call someone," Curtis finally said. "The FBI, maybe, or a congressional office, someone with authority to investigate this properly." Vernon twisted his wedding ring, a gesture that had become almost constant since finding Charlotte's connection to this place. "And what happens?" Then they confiscate everything, classify it again, tell us to keep quiet while they conduct an internal review that goes nowhere. You don't know that's what would happen." "Don't I?" Vernon looked at his son. "Curtis, this went on for 2 years. Dozens of people knew about it. Soldiers, scientists, administrators. And when it ended, they sealed it up and made everyone disappear. Those men's families were lied to. The whole thing was covered up. What makes you think the government wants this exposed now?" Curtis didn't have an answer. They sat in silence as the sky darkened, stars beginning to appear in the vastness above them. "Tomorrow," Vernon said, "we search the property. We find where those men are buried, and then we make copies of everything, every document, every photograph. We send copies to multiple places before we contact any authorities. That way, even if they try to shut us down, the truth is already out there. That could take days, and we don't know where to look. 80 acres is a lot of ground." Vernon had been thinking about that. The journal mentioned that AM supervised everything. If there are graves, they'd be marked somehow, even if just for the administrator's records. "We need to find more of AM's notes." They spent the next morning searching the property more systematically. Vernon took the farmhouse, going through every room, checking behind loose boards, examining the basement for hidden spaces. Curtis searched the barn's upper level and the remaining outbuildings. It was Vernon who found it. A false bottom in one of the kitchen cabinets, revealed when he'd pried up a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a metal box, smaller than the ones they'd found before, sealed with wax that had long since dried and cracked. Inside were more pages from AM's journal, these ones loose rather than bound. The entries were more personal, less official, as if the administrator had been keeping 2 sets of records, one for the government and one for himself. Vernon read them with growing horror. The entries described in detail what had happened to the 3 subjects who died. One had suffered a heart attack during a drug trial. Another had become violent and been killed in self-defense by security personnel. The third, Corporal Theodore Waverley, had attempted to escape and died in the attempt. But it was the final entry that made Vernon's blood run cold. March 18th, 1963, Colonel Lansing ordered me to enter the 3 deceased subjects on the northwest quadrant of the property. I marked the location with 3 stones arranged in a triangle, 50 paces due north of the old cottonwood tree. May God forgive us for what we've done here. Vernon called for Curtis, who came running. Together they studied the property map they'd found in the county records. The northwest quadrant, they could identify that easily enough. But the old cottonwood tree. They searched the property, walking the perimeter of the northwest section. It took an hour, but finally Curtis spotted it. a massive cottonwood, ancient and gnarled, standing alone in the otherwise empty grassland. The tree was dying, its bark peeling, most of its branches bare, but it was unmistakable. Vernon counted. 50 paces north, Curtis beside him, both walking in step. At 50 paces they stopped and began searching the ground. The grass had grown over everything. Decades of weather had smoothed the earth. But when Curtis kicked at a slight depression, his foot struck something solid. He knelt and began digging with his hands, Vernon joining him. 3 stones, just as AM had described, arranged in a triangle about 6 feet across. The stones were weathered, but clearly placed deliberately, and the ground within the triangle had settled slightly in a way that suggested it had been disturbed long ago. "This is it," Curtis said quietly. "This is where they buried them." Vernon sat back on his heels, looking at the simple stone markers. 3 men, killed in the name of national security, buried in unmarked graves on government land. Their families told lies about training accidents or desertion. The waste of it, the absolute criminal waste, made him want to weep. "We need to call someone now," Curtis said. "Not the FBI or the government. A journalist, someone who'll actually tell this story." Vernon nodded. "But first, we need more proof. We have documents, but we need physical evidence. Those bodies are evidence. Dad, we can't dig them up ourselves. That would be disturbing a grave. We need proper authorities, forensic teams. And by the time we get them here, someone will have gotten wind of what we're doing and stopped it." Vernon stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "We don't have to dig them up, but we need to prove they're here." Curtis understood. "Ground-penetrating radar. I can rent equipment in Cheyenne. It'll show if there are burial sites here without disturbing anything." They were walking back to the farmhouse when they heard the vehicle. Both froze, listening. The sound grew louder, not just one vehicle but several, approaching fast on the dirt road. "Get inside," Vernon said urgently. "Get the laptop. Get all the photos uploaded to the cloud storage." "Now!" Curtis ran for the house, while Vernon walked toward the approaching vehicles, intercepting them before they could get too close. 3 black SUVs pulled up, raising clouds of dust that hung in the still air. The lead vehicle's door opened, and a man stepped out, 50s, suit and tie, dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. 2 more men emerged from the other vehicles, all dressed similarly, all carrying themselves with the rigid posture of law enforcement or military. "Mr. Ashby," the first man said, not offering a handshake. "I'm Agent Kirkwood, Federal Records Management Division. I need to speak with you about this property." "Federal Records Management," Vernon repeated. "Can't say I've heard of that agency." "We handle classified materials and facilities. This property was flagged in our system when you purchased it. I need to ask you some questions about what you found here." Vernon kept his expression neutral. "Found? It's a farm. I found a lot of dirt and a barn that needs repairs." Kirkwood's smile was thin. "Mr. Ashby, let's not waste each other's time. We know there's a classified facility on this property. We know you've accessed it. We're here to secure that facility and any materials you may have removed from it. You have a warrant?" "I don't need a warrant. This is a matter of national security. Any classified materials on this property remain the property of the United States government, regardless of who owns the land." Vernon felt anger rising, but kept his voice level. "So, you're saying I bought property, but I don't actually own everything on it? That doesn't sound very legal to me." "What's legal and what's necessary aren't always the same thing," Kirkwood said. His tone hardened. "Where are the documents, Mr. Ashby? Where are the files from the underground facility?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Kirkwood removed his sunglasses, fixing Vernon with a cold stare. "You're 70 years old. You have a son. You have a modest pension. You have a life that can be made very difficult if you don't cooperate. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Where are the materials from the facility?" Vernon felt a chill. The threat was clear if unspoken, but he thought about Charlotte, about her courage in standing up to these same kinds of men 60 years ago. He thought about Corporal Waverley and the others, buried in unmarked graves 50 paces from a dying cottonwood tree. "I think you should leave my property," Vernon said quietly. "And if you come back, bring that warrant you say you don't need." Kirkwood studied him for a long moment. Then he put his sunglasses back on and pulled a business card from his pocket. "Call this number when you're ready to be reasonable. And Mr. Ashby, whatever you think you've found, whatever you think you know, it's bigger than you understand. There are reasons these things stay classified, reasons that are still relevant today, reasons like covering up murder," Vernon asked. Kirkwood's expression didn't change. "Call the number." He turned and walked back to his SUV. Vernon watched the 3 vehicles drive away, his heart hammering. His hands shook slightly as he returned to the house. Curtis was at the kitchen table with his laptop. "Did you hear all that?" "Ah, most of it." "I had the window open." Curtis turned the laptop to show Vernon. "Everything's uploaded. Documents, photos, audio recordings from our walkthrough of the facility. It's all in cloud storage, across 3 different services. Even if they confiscate our phones and computers, the evidence is safe." Vernon sat down heavily. "They threatened us, not directly but clearly enough. So what do we do?" Vernon thought about it. They had evidence, they had the truth, but they were 2 people against an organization that had already proven willing to kill to keep secrets. They needed help, the right kind of help. "You said you know a journalist?" Curtis nodded. "Angela Briggs. We went to college together. She's with the Washington Post now, covers government accountability. She's exposed classified programs before." "Call her," Vernon said. "Tell her we have documents about Cold War human experiments. Tell her we have bodies. Tell her this is the story of a lifetime, but she has to move fast." Curtis was already pulling out his phone. As he dialed, Vernon looked out the window toward the northwest quadrant, toward the 3 stones marking 3 graves. Charlotte had tried to stop this 60 years ago and failed, but she'd left a record, hoping someone would eventually find it and finish what she'd started. Vernon intended to make sure her hope wasn't in vain. Angela Briggs arrived the next morning in a rental car, a compact sedan that looked out of place on the dirt roads. She was younger than Vernon had expected, early 40s, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dressed in jeans and a blazer. She carried a professional camera and a leather bag that presumably held recording equipment. Curtis met her at the property line and walked her up to the farmhouse. Vernon watched from the porch, trying to judge whether they could trust her. She had an open, intelligent face, and the way she looked at the property, taking it all in, already assessing, suggested she took this seriously. "Mr. Ashby," she said, offering her hand. "Curtis has told me some of what you found. I need to be clear from the start. If what you're saying is true, this is going to be dangerous for all of us. The government doesn't like having its secrets exposed. We've already had visitors making that point," Vernon said, shaking her hand. "But some secrets deserve to be exposed." They spent the next 2 hours going through everything, showing her the vault, walking her through the underground facility, sharing the documents and photographs. Angela asked sharp questions, took extensive notes, and photographed everything with a professional thoroughness that Vernon found reassuring. When they reached the locked room with the personnel files, Angela's composure finally cracked. She stood reading through folder after folder, her expression moving from professional interest to genuine horror. "These are crimes," she said flatly. "Clear violations of the Nuremberg Code, possibly war crimes under international law. And the government knew. They documented it all and then buried it, along with the victims," Curtis said. He showed her the map to the burial site, explained what they'd found. Angela photographed the map, then looked at Vernon. "You said there was a personal connection? Someone you knew worked here?" Vernon had been dreading this moment. Talking about Charlotte to a stranger, exposing her part in all this, felt like a betrayal even though he knew it wasn't. But the story needed to be complete. "My wife," he said quietly. "Charlotte. She was a nurse here from 1961 to 1963. I didn't know until we found her personnel file." Angela's eyebrows rose. "She never told you?" "Not in 47 years of marriage. May I see her file?" Vernon retrieved it from the box, where he'd carefully stored everything related to Charlotte. He watched Angela read through it, the employment records, the termination papers, the complaint Charlotte had filed. She was brave, Angela said after a moment, filing that complaint, knowing what it would cost her. A lot of people would have stayed quiet. She stayed quiet after they fired her, Vernon pointed out, unable to keep a note of bitterness from his voice. Because they threatened her, Angela said gently. Look at these termination papers. Security protocols enforced. That's code for "we'll ruin your life if you talk." Your wife was 23 years old, facing down the full weight of the federal government. The fact that she documented anything at all, that she left evidence for someone to find, takes courage most people don't have. Vernon knew she was right, but it didn't make the sense of betrayal disappear. Charlotte had kept this from him their entire marriage. Every day for 47 years, she'd carried this secret while he'd shared everything with her. They were preparing to head back upstairs when Angela paused at the filing cabinet in the locked room. Wait, what's in the bottom drawer? Curtis checked. We didn't get to that one yet. It's locked separately. It took Curtis several minutes to pick the lock. When the drawer finally opened, they found it contained only one item, a sealed manila envelope, bulky with contents. Marked in handwriting, Vernon recognized instantly as Charlotte's, "For the record." His hands shook as he lifted it out. The envelope was sealed with old tape that cracked as he carefully peeled it away. Inside was a thick stack of handwritten pages, filled with Charlotte's precise, careful script. Vernon read the first page aloud, his voice catching, "My name is Charlotte Marie Brenneman. I'm writing this in March of 1963, before I leave this facility for the last time. I know that what I witnessed here will be buried, that the men who authorized these experiments will face no consequences, and that the victims will be forgotten. I cannot stop that, but I can make sure there is a record. Someday someone may find this. When they do, I want them to know exactly what was done here, and who was responsible." The document that followed was comprehensive, 47 pages detailing everything Charlotte had witnessed over her 2 years at the facility. She named names, not just Colonel Lansing, but generals, politicians, scientists who'd authorized or conducted the experiments. She described specific incidents, quoted conversations she'd overheard, documented the timeline of the project from beginning to end. She wrote about the test subjects, not just as statistics, but as individuals. Private Greer, who'd cried for his mother during a particularly brutal drug trial. Sergeant Hollis, who'd tried to help the others even as his own mind was breaking. And Corporal Waverley, who'd asked Charlotte to mail a letter to his family before he died, trying to escape. He knew they were going to kill him, Charlotte had written. They all knew by the end. The experiments had gone too far, caused too much damage. The subjects couldn't be allowed to leave and tell what had been done to them. Waverley tried to run, and they shot him. They called it attempted escape of a security risk. I call it murder. Vernon had to stop reading. He handed the pages to Angela, unable to continue. Curtis put an arm around his father's shoulders. She was the whistleblower, Angela said, reading quickly. This document, if this goes public, it implicates some very powerful people. Some of the names she mentions went on to significant positions in government and military leadership. Most are probably dead by now, Curtis pointed out. But their legacies aren't, and some might still be alive. Angela looked up from the pages, her expression grave. This is Pulitzer-level journalism, but it's also incredibly dangerous. The moment I publish this, you'll both become targets. We're already targets, Vernon said. Those agents yesterday made that clear. Angela carefully photographed every page of Charlotte's testimony. When she finished, she sat back and looked at Vernon. I need to ask you something. Why now? Your wife wrote this 60 years ago. You've had it for days. Why wait until now to call me? I had to be sure, Vernon admitted. Sure that this was the right thing to do. Sure that I wasn't just angry at Charlotte for keeping secrets. And now you're sure? Vernon thought about it. Was he sure? He was about to destroy his wife's carefully maintained privacy, expose secrets she'd kept for a lifetime, potentially put himself and Curtis in danger. But he thought about those 3 stones in the northwest quadrant, about 23 young men who'd been used and discarded, about families who'd never known the truth. Yes, he said firmly. I'm sure. Angela nodded. Then we move forward. But we do this carefully. I'll need a few days to verify everything, contact some of the families, build the full story. In the meantime, you both need to be careful. Don't talk to anyone else about this. If those agents come back, we'll call you first, Curtis finished. They were climbing back up the stairs when Vernon stopped suddenly. Something Angela had said was nagging at him. He turned back, descended a few steps, and returned to the locked room. Dad, what is it? Vernon went to the filing cabinet, pulled out Charlotte's personnel file again, and read it more carefully this time. Her employment dates, November 1961 through April 1963. Her listed address during employment, the facility itself. Her next of kin, listed as none. But Charlotte had mentioned family in her stories, parents, a sister. Why would she list no next of kin? He flipped to the next page in her file, one he'd only glanced at before. It was an application form she'd filled out when she first came to work at the facility. Under the question, "Have you been employed by any government agency previously?" She'd written no, but underneath that, in different ink, as if added later, someone had written, "Subject demonstrates suitable psychological profile. Approved for observation trial." Vernon's blood went cold. He read it again, not wanting to believe what it suggested. Curtis had come back down. "Dad, what did you find?" Vernon showed him the notation. Curtis read it, then looked at his father with dawning horror. "They didn't just hire her as a nurse," Curtis said slowly. "They recruited her as a test subject." Angela had followed them back down. She took the file, examined it carefully, then pulled out another folder from a different drawer, one marked Female Subjects. Inside were profiles of 6 women, all in their early 20s, all nurses or medical technicians. Charlotte's photo was among them. The folder contained a research proposal, study on the effectiveness of behavioral modification techniques on medical personnel with access to classified information. Subjects will be exposed to graduated levels of psychological conditioning while performing their regular duties. The goal is to determine optimal methods for ensuring long-term compliance and silence in individuals with knowledge of sensitive operations. Vernon felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Charlotte hadn't just witnessed the experiments. She'd been part of them. They'd experimented on her, tested their techniques for ensuring silence, used her as a guinea pig while she worked as their nurse. "That's why she never told you," Angela said quietly. "It wasn't just fear of consequences. They'd conditioned her not to tell. Programmed her, maybe. The nightmares, the silence about her past, those weren't just from trauma. They were from whatever they did to her brain." Vernon sat down hard on the floor, Charlotte's file clutched in his hands. All these years, he'd thought he understood his wife. Now he realized he'd been living with a victim of government experimentation, a woman who'd been psychologically altered to carry secrets she desperately wanted to share but couldn't. "She fought them anyway," Curtis said, picking up her testimony. "Even with whatever they did to her, she still wrote this. Still left evidence. That took incredible strength." Vernon looked at his son, then at the testimony, then at the facility around them. Charlotte had been both victim and hero. She'd been used, damaged, traumatized, and she'd still found a way to fight back, even if it took 60 years for her weapon to be found. "We publish everything," Vernon said, his voice hard. "Every word of her testimony, every document, every name." They took her voice away, but were giving it back. Angela nodded slowly. "Then let's get out of here and start writing. The world needs to hear Charlotte's story." They worked through the night in a motel room 2 towns over, Angela having insisted they leave the farm immediately. "If they're watching the property, we need to be somewhere unexpected," she'd said, and Vernon hadn't argued. Angela had set up her laptop on the room's small desk, organizing the documents into a coherent narrative. Curtis sat beside her, helping to scan and catalogue everything they'd brought. Vernon lay on one of the beds, ostensibly resting but actually staring at the ceiling, thinking about Charlotte. He kept returning to one question: had she known? When they'd met in 1964, when she'd smiled at him across that church social, had she been aware of what had been done to her? Or had the conditioning been so complete that she'd genuinely forgotten? He remembered their first conversation. She'd seemed guarded but not frightened, careful but not secretive. They talked about music, about the weather, about anything except their pasts. He'd thought she was just private. Now he understood she literally couldn't talk about where she'd been. "Mr. Ashby?" Angela's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "I need to ask you about something." He sat up. "What is it?" "Your wife's death. You said she died 3 years ago. What was the cause?" Vernon felt his throat tighten. "Heart attack, sudden. She was in the garden one morning and—" He couldn't finish. "Was there an autopsy?" "No, her doctor said it was clearly cardiac arrest. She'd had high blood pressure for years." He paused. "Why are you asking?" Angela exchanged a glance with Curtis. "Because I've been researching the other test subjects, the female ones from that folder. Of the 6 women, I can only find records for 3. 2 died in the 1990s, both from sudden heart attacks. The other 3 have no death records at all, which is unusual." Vernon understood what she was implying. "You think they were killed? I think it's worth investigating. If the government was monitoring these women for decades, ensuring their silence—" She left the sentence unfinished. Vernon thought about Charlotte's funeral, about the man in the dark suit who'd stood at the back of the church, watching. At the time, Vernon had assumed he was one of Charlotte's old colleagues from the hospital. Now he wondered. "We can't prove anything," Curtis said gently. "And even if we could, it doesn't change what we're doing now." "It changes everything," Vernon said, his voice sharp. "If they killed her, if they spent 47 years monitoring her, waiting to see if she'd talk, and then killed her when she was old enough that a heart attack would look natural." He stood, pacing the small room. "Then this isn't just about exposing history. It's about justice for Charlotte." Angela closed her laptop. "Mr. Ashby, I understand you're angry, but we need to stay focused. The story I'm writing is about the Cold War experiments, about the victims, about your wife's testimony. If I start making accusations about recent murders without proof, I lose credibility, and the whole story gets dismissed as conspiracy theory." Vernon knew she was right, but the rage burning in his chest wouldn't be reasoned away. For 3 years, he'd mourned Charlotte's death as a natural tragedy. Now he had to consider that someone had murdered her, had stopped her heart to ensure a 60-year-old secret stayed buried. His phone rang, startling all of them. Vernon checked the screen. Unknown number. "Don't answer it," Curtis said immediately. But Vernon was already swiping to accept. "Hello? Mr. Ashby." The voice was familiar. "Agent Kirkwood. We need to meet." "I don't think so. I'm not threatening you. I'm trying to help. There are people who don't want this story to come out, people with resources and no conscience. If you publish what you found, you're putting yourself and your son in danger. Is that a threat?" "It's a warning. I'm not one of the bad guys here, Mr. Ashby. I'm just a records manager trying to keep classified information contained. But there are others, people who were involved in the project, people who have reputations to protect, who won't be as reasonable as me." Vernon glanced at Angela, who was gesturing frantically for him to keep Kirkwood talking while she recorded the call. "What are you proposing?" Vernon asked. "Give me the documents. All of them. In exchange, I can guarantee your safety. The project will be officially acknowledged as a regrettable Cold War excess. The victims' families will receive compensation. Your wife's testimony will be entered into the classified record, but not made public. Some things need to stay classified, Mr. Ashby, for national security." "No," Vernon said firmly. "The only security you're protecting is job security for people who committed crimes. Charlotte wrote that testimony because she wanted the truth to come out. I'm going to honor that." There was a long pause. "Then I can't help you," Kirkwood said finally. "And I won't be able to protect you from the people who come next." The line went dead. Angela stopped the recording. That was either a genuine warning or an intimidation tactic. "Either way, it means we're running out of time." "How long until you can publish?" Curtis asked. 48 hours. I need to verify sources, get statements from victims' families, have our legal team review everything for libel issues." She looked at Vernon. "Can you stay hidden for 2 days?" "We can try," Vernon said. But he was thinking about Charlotte. about whether she'd been able to hide from them for 3 years or 47. Either way, they'd found her in the end. Curtis's phone buzzed. He checked it, then showed the screen to his father. It was a text from an unknown number. "Check your email." Vernon opened his email app. One new message. No sender name, no subject line. Just a link. "Don't click that," Angela warned. It could be malware or a tracking program. But Curtis had already opened it on his laptop using security protocols. The link led to a file storage site, and the site contained a single folder, Project Coldbrook, Additional Evidence. Inside were audio files, dozens of them, each labeled with dates from 1962 and 1963. Curtis clicked on one at random. After a moment of static, a voice came through the laptop speakers, young, male, frightened. "My name is Corporal Theodore Waverley. Today is February 20th, 1963. They're making me record this as part of the experiment. I don't know why. They gave me something this morning, a pill. I can't remember what happened after that. There are hours missing. When I asked about it, they just smiled. I'm scared. I think they're going to kill us." The recording ended abruptly. Vernon felt like he'd been punched. Waverley's voice, preserved for 60 years, finally being heard. Angela was already downloading the files. "This is incredible. These are the subject's own words. Someone kept recordings. Someone's sending them to us," Curtis corrected. "Someone inside the government who wants this exposed." They spent the next hour listening to the recordings. 23 voices, 23 men describing their experiences, their fear, their slow realization that they weren't going to be allowed to leave. The final recordings were the most harrowing. Men who knew they were dying, leaving messages for families they'd never see again. Vernon listened to all of it, bearing witness the way Charlotte had, the way someone needed to. These men deserved to have their stories told. When the last recording finished, Angela looked at Vernon with new determination. "I'm moving up the publication timeline. This goes live tomorrow morning. We've got everything we need." They worked through the night, Angela writing and revising, while Curtis and Vernon reviewed documents one more time, ensuring nothing was missed. By 4 a.m, Angela had a draft, 8,000 words detailing Project Coldbrook, the victims, and Charlotte's role as both witness and victim. "I'm sending this to my editor," she said, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Once I do, there's no going back." "You're both sure?" Vernon thought about Charlotte, about the weight she'd carried alone. "Send it." Angela hit the button. "It'll go live at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, 3 hours from now." Vernon felt oddly calm. For 3 years, he'd drifted through life without purpose, marking time until he could join Charlotte. Now, in the last place he'd expected, he'd found a reason to keep going. Not just to expose the truth, but to give Charlotte's voice back to her. Curtis had fallen asleep in a chair, exhausted. Vernon watched his son sleep, grateful that Curtis had come with him, that they'd done this together. Whatever happened next, they'd face it as a family. At 5:30, Vernon's phone rang again. This time it was a number he recognized. His neighbor from the apartment building in Cheyenne, Mrs. Pacheco. "Mrs. Pacheco? Is everything all right?" "Vernon, there are men at your old apartment. They're asking about you, about where you went. They don't look like police." Her voice was worried. "I didn't tell them anything, but they're going door to door. Thank you for letting me know." "Don't worry about it. I'll handle it." He hung up and woke Curtis. "They're looking for us." Angela was monitoring her email. "My editor just sent an emergency message. Someone from the Justice Department called the Post, demanding we kill the story. They're claiming national security implications." "What did your editor say?" "She told them we publish at 6. Angela smiled grimly. "The Post doesn't kill stories because the government asks nicely." At 5:45, they heard vehicles pulling into the motel parking lot. Multiple engines, doors slamming. Vernon moved to the window and carefully looked out through the curtain. 4 SUVs, at least a dozen men. Kirkwood was among them, along with others in suits and some in tactical gear. "They found us," Curtis said, looking over his father's shoulder. Angela was frantically typing. "I'm sending backup copies to 3 other journalists. If they take us, the story still gets out." A knock at the door, hard, official. "Mr. Ashby, this is Agent Kirkwood. Open the door." Vernon looked at Angela, then at Curtis. His son met his eyes with steady determination. They'd come too far to back down now. Do you have a warrant? Vernon called through the door. National security supersedes warrant requirements. Open the door or we'll open it for you. Vernon checked his watch. 5:48. 12 minutes until publication. We just need to stall, Angela whispered. She was on her phone now, recording video. If they take us, this goes straight to my editor. The pounding on the door intensified. Last chance, Mr. Ashby. Vernon made a decision. He unlocked the door and opened it. Kirkwood stood there with two armed men behind him. Mr. Ashby, you and your son are coming with us. Miss Briggs, you're interfering with a federal investigation. I'm a journalist doing my job, Angela said, still recording. And you're threatening civilians who've committed no crime. They've stolen classified documents. They found documents on property they legally own, Angela corrected. Documents about crimes committed by the government. Kirkwood's jaw tightened. This is your last chance. Come quietly, and we can work something out. Make this difficult, and I can't guarantee your safety. Vernon felt Curtis tense beside him, ready to fight. But Vernon put a hand on his son's shoulder. It's all right, he said quietly. Then to Kirkwood, we'll come with you. But I want to make one thing clear. Whatever you do to us, whatever happens, the story is already out. Multiple copies, multiple journalists, uploaded to secure servers. You can arrest us, you can threaten us, but you can't stop the truth anymore. Kirkwood's expression suggested he knew Vernon was right. Get in the vehicles. As they were being led out, Vernon checked his watch one more time. 5:59. 1 minute. They were being put into separate SUVs when Angela's phone chimed. She looked at the screen and smiled. It's live, she announced loudly. The story just went live on the Washington Post website. Project Coldbrook is public knowledge as of right now. Kirkwood's phone started ringing. He answered it, listened, his face darkening. After a moment, he hung up and looked at Vernon with something that might have been respect. You win this round, he said quietly. My superiors have decided that attempting to suppress the story now would only make it bigger. You're free to go. Vernon didn't move.
Just like that?
Just like that. The story's out. Damage is done. No point in making it worse by arresting a 70-year-old man and his son. Kirkwood paused. For what it's worth, I think your wife was brave. What was done to those men, to her, was wrong. Then why try to stop us? Because I'm a bureaucrat, Mr. Ashby. I follow orders. But sometimes I'm glad when people don't. Kirkwood and his men got back in their vehicles and left. Vernon, Curtis, and Angela stood in the motel parking lot as the sun rose, watching the SUVs disappear. Is it really over? Curtis asked. Angela was scrolling through her phone. The story's already trending. Thousands of shares in the first 5 minutes. This is going to be huge. Vernon felt exhausted and exhilarated at the same time. They'd done it. Charlotte's testimony was public. The victims' voices were being heard. The truth, so long buried, was finally in the light. By noon, the story had exploded across every major news outlet. Vernon's phone rang constantly. Journalists requesting interviews, government officials offering statements, lawyers representing victims' families wanting to discuss wrongful death suits. Curtis fielded most of the calls, while Vernon simply tried to process what was happening. Angela had stayed with them, conducting interviews via video call with various news programs. She'd become the face of the story, explaining the documents, playing excerpts from the audio recordings, and repeatedly emphasizing Charlotte's role in preserving the evidence. She's the real hero here, Angela said during one interview. Charlotte Brenneman Ashby witnessed these crimes, documented them, and left a record, even though she knew it might cost her everything. Without her testimony, we'd never have known the full scope of what happened at that facility. Vernon watched from the motel room bed, still struggling with conflicting emotions. Pride in Charlotte's courage, anger at what had been done to her, grief that she'd never known her testimony would finally be heard. Around 2 o'clock, Curtis came over and sat beside his father. Dad, there's someone here to see us. She says her name is Patricia Waverly. Vernon sat up. Waverly? As in Corporal Theodore Waverly's sister. She's 91 years old. Her daughter drove her here after she saw the news. They found Patricia Waverley in the motel lobby, a tiny woman with white hair and sharp blue eyes, leaning on a cane. Her daughter, a woman in her 60s, stood protectively beside her. "Mr. Ashby?" Patricia's voice was surprisingly strong. "I needed to meet you, to thank you." Vernon shook her hand gently. "Mrs. Waverley, I'm so sorry about your brother." "My baby brother," she corrected, tears forming. "He was 19 years old. They told us he died in a training accident in Nevada. For 60 years I believed that. I mourned him without ever knowing the truth." She gripped Vernon's hand tighter. "You gave me the truth. You let me hear his voice again. That recording, hearing Teddy talk about being scared, it broke my heart all over again. But at least now I know. He didn't die in an accident. He was murdered. And he deserves justice. He'll get it," Vernon promised. "The story's out now. There will be investigations, congressional hearings. The families will finally know what happened." Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a young man in uniform, grinning at the camera, the same face Vernon had seen in the facility photos. "This was Teddy," she said. "I want you to have it. You found him, Mr. Ashby. You brought him home in a way. My family can finally have closure." Vernon took the photograph carefully. "There's more. We found where they buried him, on the farm property. If your family wants, we can arrange for proper burial services." Patricia's tears flowed freely now. Her daughter put an arm around her shoulders. "We would like that very much," Patricia said. "All these years we had no grave to visit. Now, because of you and your wife, we'll finally be able to lay him to rest properly." After they left, Vernon sat holding the photograph of young Theodore Waverley. Curtis sat beside him. "That's going to keep happening," Curtis said quietly. "More families are going to reach out. They're going to want answers, closure, justice. We'll help them however we can," Vernon said. Angela appeared in the doorway. "I just got word. The Senate has announced an official investigation into Project Coldbrook. They're calling for full disclosure of all classified documents related to Cold War human experimentation programs. And they want you both to testify." "Testify?" Vernon repeated. "You found the facility. You documented everything. You're key witnesses." Angela paused. "There's something else. Someone left this at the front desk for you." She handed Vernon a manila envelope. No return address, no name, just Vernon Ashby written on the front. Vernon opened it carefully. Inside was a single document, a declassified memo dated 1985. The memo detailed an internal government review of Project Coldbrook and other similar programs. The review had concluded that crimes had been committed, that victims deserved compensation, and that full disclosure should be made. But the memo's final paragraph was highlighted in yellow. Recommendation: suppress all evidence of experimental programs. Public disclosure would undermine confidence in government institutions and provide propaganda opportunities for foreign adversaries. All participants to be monitored indefinitely to ensure silence. Use of termination protocols authorized if subjects pose disclosure risk. Attached to the memo was a list of names, the female test subjects from Project Coldbrook. Charlotte's name was on the list. Next to each name was a date. The dates next to two of the names corresponded with their deaths in the 1990s. Next to Charlotte's name was a date, 3 years ago. The exact day she'd died. Vernon stared at the document, his hands shaking. They'd killed her. The government had murdered his wife to keep her silent, had stopped her heart and made it look natural. Curtis read over his shoulder. "Dad, they killed her," Vernon said, his voice hollow. "For 60 years they watched her, and when she got old, when a heart attack wouldn't look suspicious, they killed her." Angela took the document carefully. "This is proof. This is evidence of ongoing conspiracy, of murder. This changes everything." Vernon looked up at her, his grief hardening into resolve. "Then we use it. We make sure everyone knows, not just what they did in 1963, but what they did 3 years ago. Charlotte's death wasn't the end of the story. It was part of the story. Who sent this?" Curtis asked, examining the envelope. "Someone with access to classified files," Angela said. "Someone who wants the whole truth to come out." She met Vernon's eyes. "Your wife wasn't the only brave person in this story. Mr. Ashby, someone inside the government is still fighting to expose these crimes." Vernon stood, still holding the photograph of Theodore Waverley and the memo about Charlotte's death. Two victims, 60 years apart, connected by the same criminal conspiracy. "Then we finish it," he said. "We expose everything. Every crime, every cover-up, every murder. We owe that to Charlotte. We owe it to Waverley and all the others. The truth doesn't stop in 1963. It comes all the way to today." 3 months later, Vernon stood at the barn entrance, watching the dedication ceremony unfold. Media cameras lined the perimeter. Congressmen gave speeches, and family members of the victims gathered around the newly installed memorial plaque. The plaque was bronze, mounted on a granite stone, positioned where everyone entering the barn would see it. Curtis had helped design it, working with the victims' families to ensure every name was included. Vernon read the inscription for what must have been the 100th time, in memory of the 23 men subjected to experimentation under Project Coldbrook. 1961-1963, may their courage and sacrifice never be forgotten. And in honor of Charlotte Vernon Ashby, who refused to be silent. Below that were all 23 names, arranged alphabetically. Theodore Waverley's name was near the bottom. Patricia Waverley stood beside Vernon, her daughter supporting her. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Teddy would be proud." The congressional hearings had lasted 6 weeks. Vernon and Curtis had testified, as had Angela and several forensic experts who'd examined the facility. The declassified memo proving the government's ongoing monitoring and ultimate termination of Charlotte and the other female subjects had caused a political firestorm. 2 former officials had been indicted for conspiracy to commit murder. Others had resigned rather than face investigation. The Senate had issued a formal apology and established a compensation fund for victims' families. But for Vernon, the most meaningful outcome had been simpler. Charlotte's grave now bore an additional inscription. Beneath her name and dates, Curtis had added, "Nurse, witness, hero." She spoke truth to power. Vernon visited the grave every Sunday, just as he'd visited every Sunday for 3 years. But now, when he spoke to Charlotte, he knew who she really was. Not just his wife, but a woman who'd fought against injustice even when it cost her everything. The property itself had been transformed. The farmhouse had been renovated, converted into a small museum and education center. The underground facility had been documented by historians and would eventually be opened for guided tours. The barn remained largely as it was, though the vault door now stood permanently open, no more secrets to hide. Curtis had taken a permanent leave from his job in Denver and moved into one of the farmhouse's upstairs rooms. Father and son worked together now, managing the memorial site, coordinating with researchers and journalists, helping victims' families find closure. Their relationship had deepened in ways Vernon hadn't thought possible. The distance that had characterized their interactions for years had disappeared, replaced by genuine companionship. They'd been through something together, accomplished something meaningful, and it had bound them in a way that ordinary life never could. As the ceremony concluded, Angela approached. She'd won several journalism awards for her coverage of Project Coldbrook and had been promoted to senior investigative reporter. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said. She introduced an elderly man, perhaps 80, with kind eyes and a government badge on a lanyard around his neck. "This is Ronald Kemp. He's the one who sent you that declassified memo." Vernon shook his hand. "You took a risk." "I'd been tracking Project Coldbrook files for 20 years, Kemp said, "ever since I stumbled across references to it in other classified documents. When I saw that the property had been sold, I knew someone might finally discover what was there. I wanted to help however I could. You gave us the evidence we needed," Vernon said. "Charlotte's death, we'd never have proven it without that memo. She deserved justice," Kemp said simply. They all did. After the last guests had left, Vernon and Curtis walked to the northwest quadrant. The area had been landscaped now, the 3 stone markers replaced with proper headstones. The remains had been exhumed, identified through DNA and dental records, and several families had claimed their loved ones for reburial elsewhere. But 3 remained here, including Theodore Waverley, whose sister had wanted him to rest on the land where he died. "You did it, Dad," Curtis said as they stood before the graves. "You gave them their voices back." Vernon thought about that. Had he given them voices, or had Charlotte? She'd written the testimony, preserved the evidence, fought against the conditioning that tried to keep her silent. He'd just been the one who found it and brought it to light. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps finding lost truths and making sure they were heard was its own form of heroism. "Your mother did it," Vernon said. "I just finished what she started." They stood in silence for a while, the wind blowing across the grassland like it had for centuries. The old cottonwood tree had been treated by an arborist and was showing signs of recovery, new growth on branches that had seemed dead. "What's next?" Curtis asked. Vernon considered the question. He was 70 years old, had lost his wife, his savings, and the comfortable retirement he'd planned. But he'd gained purpose, reconnected with his son, and helped right a terrible wrong. The $50 farm had turned out to be the best investment he'd ever made. "We keep this place going," Vernon said. "We make sure people remember. And we live the kind of life Charlotte would be proud of. Honest, open, fighting for what's right." Curtis smiled. "Sounds like a good plan." As the sun set over the high plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Vernon felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. Charlotte's secret was no longer a burden, but a legacy. Her silence had been broken, her courage celebrated, her sacrifice honored. He touched his wedding ring, worn thin after 47 years, and whispered to the wind, "I understand now. Thank you for being brave enough to leave the truth behind. I hope I made you proud." The wind carried his words across the grassland, past the barn and the memorial plaque, toward the future where Charlotte's story would continue to inspire others to speak truth, no matter the cost. Vernon Ashby had bought a farm for $50 and discovered that some things, truth, justice, love, were worth infinitely more.